In our last activity and where we left off, what we had seen is that different environments actually impacted the number of individuals who were homozygous dominant, heterozygous, or homozygous recessive for that hemoglobin allele. Today, what we're going to start to look at then is kind of understanding how exactly our environment is affecting how common those genotypes are in a population, okay? So when we start to look at something like this, an environment selecting for a genotype or against a genotype, what we're really looking at is the process of evolution. And evolution is just going to be the process by which populations of organisms or species. So remember, a population is a group of individuals of the same species that live together in the same place at the same time. Okay. So looking at how those populations actually change over time. And the changes that we're looking at are changes in genotype and changes in phenotype. So directly connected to everything that we were just learning. The person who kind of discovered, or is the kind of person credited as discovering evolution and coming up with this theory, is Charles Darwin. And he proposed that all new species come from existing species or species that are already common and already existing, and that the process by which these species come into existence is something that we call natural selection, which I'm sure you've heard of. Natural selection is going to be one mechanism. There's actually five that we're going to talk about, by which organisms that have favorable traits, okay, for a particular environment survive and reproduce. They then pass those traits on to future generations. And in order for natural selection to occur, we actually have to meet four specific conditions. The first condition is something that we call variation. So, what this means is that individuals in a population differ for a particular trait. Okay, so if we look at our example right here, we see phenotypic variation. We have a camel with two humps and a camel with one hump. Now, the variation that we see in this population then is just going to be the number of humps that that camel has. Okay. Now, a lot of people, they think these humps store water. They actually store food. Okay. So just something to kind of keep in mind. Now, these variations are going to be also what we call phenotypes. So when we think about the traits that we are selecting for or against in natural selection, we're really looking at how the individual looks. Now, one of the things that makes evolution and natural selection hard is that a lot of people have misconceptions. So we want to make sure we clear up those misconceptions as we go through this. So it's important for you to know that new alleles for variations cannot come into existence to increase or enhance the survival of a species or a population, okay? So the variations that we're looking at here are going to be variations that already exist. Before natural selection happens, before that environment is changing, the variation is already there, okay? Now, kind of the next component of this is going to be that variation, those differences in the phenotypes of the individuals, they need to be inherited, okay? So what that means is they have to be passed from parent to offspring through the genes or through the DNA, whatever genetic material we're talking about. So in humans and animals and a lot of the organisms we're looking at, that's going to be the DNA. So this needs to be something in the DNA. Now, the variations are originally, so that original source of variation is going to come from mutations. Okay, so the DNA changes. Remember, the only mutations that can be passed on from parent to offspring are the ones that are carried in the gametes, the sperm cells and egg cells. Okay, so mutations that happen throughout your lifetime are not passed on. All right, but the original source of variation is mutation. And then within our population, the way those variations are inherited or passed down, or the way that's maintained, is going to be through the recombination of genes during meiosis. So if you remember the chromosome swap segments, we have random fertilization, okay? All of that is going to be going with this portion of inheritance, okay? So what this means is parents are passing on traits that are in the DNA to their offspring. So here we're saying this camel has passed on their genes for one hump to their offspring. Now, again, clearing up these misconceptions. It's really, really important to know that traits that you acquire throughout your lifetime, okay? So traits that are acquired, okay, or things that you kind of gain throughout your lifetime, they are not passed on to offspring, right? If I work out super hard and I get super muscular, my children are not going to be super muscular. It's not my DNA that would be passed on if we're talking about something that we've acquired throughout our lifetime. Okay. Now, those variations that are inherited are going to lead to what we call differential survival and reproduction. And a lot of times in your textbook, it's going to say something like overproduction or struggle for existence. Okay, so those are terms that we kind of see with differential survival and reproduction that you might see in your textbook. So, what we're looking at here with differential survival and reproduction is that typically we're going to see that there are more offspring produced than our environment can support. Okay, so what this means is organisms are competing for limited resources. Individuals then that have a beneficial trait, so something that helps them, increases their success in competition, they are more likely to both survive and reproduce than those that don't have the trait. When we talk about this ability to survive and reproduce, we call that fitness. Okay? So if you have a variation or a phenotype that increases your fitness, it means that it is increasing your ability to survive and reproduce. Okay? A trait that helps an organism survive and reproduce is going to become more common in the population over time. Okay? So, again, we're looking at some kind of limited resource. We're saying more offspring are born than can survive, so we're competing. Okay? So if we go back to our camel example, we have our two variations, two humps and one hump, okay? Two humps, we're going to say, is carrying more fat, more extra nutrients, and one hump is going to be carrying less fat, less extra nutrients. If these camels, this population of camels, live in an environment and it changes and the food source becomes really, really scarce, having more fat, more extra nutrients kind of stored on the body, that's going to increase survival. So here, the adaptation, oops, okay, or that thing that increases survival is going to be the two humps. That trait is going to increase fitness, which means that the two-hump camels are more likely to survive and reproduce. Over time in future generations, we expect to see more camels with two humps. Okay. Now, again, clearing up that misconception. All right. Different traits are going to be beneficial in different environments. So, a lot of people think, like, hey, this trait is always going to increase fitness. Well, it's important to know that selection for or against a trait is going to be totally dependent on the environment. Okay. Beneficial traits are not the same in all environments, and a trait that's beneficial in one that increases fitness may not be beneficial in another. Okay. All right. Very last portion here, last kind of component of natural selection occurring is going to be adaptation. Okay. This is going to be your descent with modification. So you'll sometimes see that in a textbook, descent with modification. So again, I use this term on the previous portion where I said something that increases fitness is an adaptation. So an adaptation is going to be any phenotypic variation that increases fitness. Again, fitness is the term for survival and reproduction in an environment. A trait that increases survival leads to organisms with the beneficial trait leaving more offspring. So again, more offspring, means higher fitness. Okay. In each generation, what we expect is to see the frequency or the how common that trait is. Okay, so the frequency of the trait should increase. Over time, natural selection will result in populations that are well adapted to the environment. Okay. Something important to know, this process is typically not fast, although there are a couple of populations we can see this occurring in really quickly, like a bacterial population, single-celled organisms, but a lot of the times it's going to take many, many generations to occur, thousands of years, millions of years. It's not quick, okay? So if we think back to our camel example, where we said our environment change became really, really scarce food during periods of time, what we would expect to see in the future population would be lots of camels with two humps. Put a lot of them there. But it's important to note that those camels with one hump wouldn't disappear. We'd probably still see them here or there. We would probably still see some heterozygous individuals, but we would see a population with mostly organisms with two humps and less organisms with one hump. So that's that adaptation piece. It doesn't mean a new species is forming, but it does mean that the population we're looking at is changing. Okay, so remember, natural selection is going to explain how evolution occurs, but it's important to remember that we don't end up with individuals that are perfect. Okay, there's going to be a lot of flaws in this process because the whole thing is due to chance. All right, what we end up with though is organisms that are well adapted to the environment based on the variations that they have. Okay, now I want you to think about how does this apply to our sickle cell anemia as a disease? And I do want you to think about, can you identify the V, the I, the D, and the A in our sickle cell anemia example to describe how that population is changing over time? I hope you have a great day, and I hope this was helpful.